Chapter 5 Gülen and Sartre on Responsibility. The last two chapters focused on the ideal human as conceived by Confucius, Socrates, and Gülen, and the role that such ideal humans play in state or national governance and in community leadership. We concluded by affirming that all three thinkers were humanists in the broad sense of the term, primarily because they deeply support the idea that human beings are capable of actualizing in themselves a moral and intellectual ideal, that a human society can progress as a whole toward that ideal on a collective level, and that education is the principal mechanism through which this is accomplished. The entire discussion of the previous two chapters relies on a fundamental conviction about human beings which Gülen discusses throughout his work, and to which he is principally committed in his writings: the idea that human beings are responsible for the world. Human responsibility for the world, for one's own life and the lives of others, for society and for the future, is a constant theme across the centuries of humanism and in much religious discourse. Indeed, the central principles of humanism about the power, capacity, ability, and beauty of human beings individually and collectively make no sense, or at least are vulnerable to the charge of moral vacuity, unless accompanied by a strong belief in human responsibility in and for the world. To affirm human power and ability in the world, but not human responsibility to employ that power in the creation of the parts of the world amenable to human intervention, seems illogical at best, or cynical at worst. Humanistic philosophy, that is, a belief in the ability and responsibility of human beings to be creators of the world in some meaningful sense, has been, therefore, the back on which people and societies have accomplished some of the greatest of human achievements. So many wonders of the world in art, literature, architecture, social and political philosophy and application, medical science, and other areas exist because people believed in their power to create new things, develop new perspectives, and achieve new breakthroughs. Some saw their power as given to them by God or gods and viewed their service and achievements as worship of God. Others viewed their power from a non-religious perspective. In both cases, people claimed their power from wherever it derived, as well as their responsibility to use that power for the good of society. For the final dialogue in this book on the theme of responsibility, I could choose as Gülen's dialogue partner any number of humanists from the long lines of both the Western and Eastern traditions. Many philosophers, writers, statesmen, theorists, and thinkers from many centuries and across cultures have dwelt on the theme of responsibility to varying degrees in their work. Even those with strong theological commitments to an all-powerful, all-knowing, predestining God could make this list of those who assert a strong notion of human responsibility for the world. Gülen himself falls into this category. For this last dialogue, however, I have chosen the chief expositor for one of the most influential schools of philosophy in the 20th century, and one who defends more than anyone else the notion of human responsibility for virtually everything. That philosopher is Jean-Paul Sartre, from the existentialist school of thought. Immediately, questions arise concerning this choice, legitimate questions that we must address before we proceed. First of all, it might seem problematic to pair Gülen with an atheist such as Sartre. How could any resonance or dialogue exist between an atheist on the one hand and a Muslim scholar on the other? Why should we want there to be any dialogue between them? Atheists and theists, especially monotheists, commonly denounce each other and thus are not interested in dialogue. This, however, is the very reason why such a dialogue must occur, even if in this case it only occurs in the pages of a book. The inherently free nature of human conscience virtually guarantees that atheists and monotheists, and all shades of belief or unbelief in between, will continue to exist in the world as they do now and probably always have. Mutual denunciations of atheists and believers do nothing but undermine peaceful coexistence in today's globalized and staggeringly diverse world. We cannot afford to allow mutual denunciations to become or remain the norm among people who disagree on matters of belief. We must encourage dialogue even among those who have, or seem to have, nothing to say to each other. Second, Gülen himself openly criticizes Sartre in existentialism. In The Statue of Our Souls, Gülen places existentialism on a long list of aberrant isms that swept through Turkey and the West in the late 19th and 20th centuries, including Marxism, Durkheimsm, Leninism, and Maoism. He says of the Turkish youth of that period, "Some consoled themselves with the dreams of communism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Some went and sank into Freudian complexes. Some lost their minds to existentialism and became entangled with Sartre. Some slobbered over the sacred by quoting Marcuse. Some started to waste their lives among the delirium of Camus." Clearly, Gülen is not a fan of existentialism, or of two of its chief proponents, Sartre and Camus. Therefore, how and why should we place Sartre into any kind of meaningful conversation with Gülen's ideas when Gülen has such a low opinion of Sartre's ideas? This is simply another version of the first question. Gülen rejects existentialism on many points. Sartre, were he alive, would reject many of Gülen's ideas. Again, however, this does not preclude a dialogue between them. If it does, then the entire project of dialogue, so central to the Gülen movement, is severely undermined because only those who largely agree could dialogue with each other. Genuine relationship and respect can exist between people who strongly disagree with each other's viewpoints, as do Gülen and Sartre, or any other believer and atheist. Moreover, Gülen can fulfill his duty as a Muslim scholar obligated by the Quran to deplore atheism by rejecting atheistic ideas, but still respecting the person for simply being a human being who possesses inherent worth and dignity. Dialogue is the means by which we maintain our focus on the humanity of others, even when, or perhaps especially when, we strongly disagree with their ideas. Finding commonalities amidst radical difference is a proven strategy for peaceful coexistence among people who largely disagree. Such difficult dialogues may, in fact, be the most important ones to have. So, with this in mind, let us turn to Sartre and Gülen to see what connections, if any, can possibly exist between their ideas. Sartre's ideas and those of existentialism as a whole suffer from the popularity the existentialist movement had in the middle part of the 20th century. That is, it became so popular as a philosophy, both in France and throughout the West, that it became even a fashion fad. Existentialism was, and still is, spread in the vernacular by those whose interpretations reflect a popular mass understanding of its ideas, rather than a sustained and thorough reading of its central themes as they are expressed across the work of the school's many representatives. This is complicated as well by the fact that most existentialists do not agree with each other on all points, or on many points, at all in some cases. Most people view Sartre, one of the more prolific writers in the school, as the central expositor of the entire existentialist perspective, a position that he accepts to some extent in certain moments of his work. Sartre was well aware of the limited and often outright erroneous interpretations of existentialism and the claims made in the popular culture about the school of thought as a whole. He addresses these concerns in an essay commonly called Existentialism as a Humanism, or simply Existentialism, in a larger work published in 1957 called Existentialism and Human Emotions. In this excerpt, Sartre identifies the chief mistakes people make in interpreting existentialism or in identifying its central assertions about human reality. As he defends existentialism against these problematic claims, we see a vision of human beingness in the world quite distinct from the most common renderings of existentialism. Sartre articulates a theme of human responsibility that inspires passionate action and powerful affirmation of human ability to shape the world. Sartre stops just short of using the term duty to describe the relationship of humans toward the world that they can shape. However, the spirit of the word is there, even if the letter is not. Those who choose to live in the world and not take responsibility for it are living a less than fully human life, and they are cowards. This assertion, along with others like it, form a core of ideas that, as it turns out, resonate quite powerfully with selected themes in Gülen's thought. Sartre summarizes the charges against existentialism at the beginning of the essay, then goes on to define and explain his version of it. As he explains existentialism's basic components, he answers the most common charges leveled against it. The charges are simple and well known, based on the popular understanding of existentialism, that it encourages passivity or quietism, that it dwells on and revels in everything ugly about life, and that it denies the seriousness of human undertakings. In short, people criticize and reject French atheistic existentialism because they interpret it as a kind of nihilism or celebration of nothingness. Nothing ultimate exists, no God, no absolute values, no fixed or essential meaning for life or people. Therefore, there is no point in becoming socially or politically active, nor in undertaking sustained efforts to improve the world or to achieve breakthroughs in knowledge. Sartre rejects, even lightly mocks, this understanding of existentialism and spends the first part of his answer to these charges by defining existentialism accurately. He says that all the varieties of existentialism, the Christian and the atheistic, assert one common claim, that existence precedes essence. Sartre, as a defender of the atheistic variety, says that this claim especially holds true for his version of existentialism. Essence here refers to a purpose, meaning, or nature. Most inanimate objects are created to fulfill a purpose or meaning that exists in the minds of their creators. A paper cutter, for example, comes into existence after its inventor designs and manufactures it in response to a purpose, goal, or meaning the inventor has for the paper cutter. The inventor needs something to cut paper, but nothing exists to do this, so he invents a paper cutter whose purpose and meaning in existence is to cut paper. Its essence precedes its existence. Most people, says Sartre, think of God in this way with reference to human beings. God created human beings to fulfill his purpose, and their meaning is tied to that purpose. Their essence precedes their existence, just like the paper cutter. Meaning, purpose, and nature are predetermined by their creators in both instances. Entities come into existence and, in the case of humans, seek to learn that purpose in order to find happiness. Sartre, however, is an atheist, which means that there is no God in whose mind human meaning, purpose, and nature, human essence, live before he creates the humans themselves. Since there is no God, humans simply come into being, thrown into existence first, and their essence comes later. For humans, existence precedes essence, and this is the first principle of existentialism. Sartre explains. What is meant here by saying that existence precedes essence? It means that, first of all, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. If man, as the existentialist conceives him, is indefinable, it is because at first he is nothing. Only afterwards will he be something, and he himself will have made what he will be. Thus there is no human nature, since there is no God to conceive it. Not only is man what he conceives himself to be, but he is also only what he wills himself to be after this thrust toward existence. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Such is the first principle of existentialism. So there exists no predetermined meaning or purpose for human life or lives because there is no God to have conceived it. Human beings simply exist, are thrown into being, and must make for themselves their purpose, meaning, and nature. Already in this first principle, we see the seeds of responsibility that Sartre sows into his philosophy of human beings, especially since human beings come into existence as thinking beings, and as they cognitively develop, become self-aware. Sartre continues, Man is at the start a plan which is aware of itself rather than a patch of moss, a piece of garbage, or a cauliflower. Nothing exists prior to this plan. There is nothing in heaven. Man will be what he will have planned to be. But if existence really does precede essence, man is responsible for what he is. Thus, existentialism's first move is to make every man aware of what he is and to make the full responsibility of his existence rest on him. And when we say that a man is responsible for himself, we do not only mean that he is responsible for his own individuality, but that he is responsible for all men. Two important issues for our discussion emerge from this passage. First, the responsibility of which Sartre speaks extends past any individual human being to all human beings. This claim is tied to Sartre's understanding of subjectivity, that is, at all times human beings are tied to the world, to the human world, to the world of human being. We can never get outside the world, outside our own humanness, outside to an objective perspective in isolation from the world and others. We all exist by nature in the world with others, as a part of the world, in communal human beingness. Therefore, when we choose for our lives and take responsibility for creating our lives, we are not creating just for ourselves alone. We are creating for everyone because we are tied to everyone. We are rooted in subjectivity. To choose is to advance the choice, not just for ourselves individually, but for everyone. Sartre says, "In creating the man that we want to be, there is not a single one of our acts which does not at the same time create an image of man as we think we ought to be." A second important point from the lengthy quote above concerns Sartre's definition of a human being. In the quote, he distinguishes human beings from a patch of moss, a piece of garbage, or a cauliflower. Human beings are not merely objects among other objects, left to the hands of fate, the whims of blind bodily instinct, destiny, or weather. Later in the essay, he makes this point more strongly. He says of the theory of existentialism, "This theory is the only one which gives man dignity, the only one which does not reduce him to an object. The effect of all materialism is to treat all men, including the one philosophizing, as objects. That is, as an ensemble of determined reactions in no way distinguished from the ensemble of qualities and phenomena which constitute a table, or a chair, or a stone. We definitely wish to establish the human realm as an ensemble of values distinct from the material realm." Here, Sartre is separating existentialism from materialism, which Gülen and many others with a religious perspective reject so definitively either as a symptom of spiritual sickness, an aspect of atheism, or a reductionist account of human life. Sartre rejects it too, albeit through different channels of argumentation. Sartre's existentialism does not allow people to be at the level of stones, chairs, or pieces of moss. Instead, it insists that humans are much more than this, not because they are made by God with a purpose or meaning, but because from birth onward, we clearly exhibit in our own lives the capacity for consciousness, self-consciousness, and self-self-consciousness, which is unlike any other living being. Unlike other beings, we think in the full Cartesian sense of the word, which includes self-thinking or thinking upon the self. This marks a categorical difference between humans and all other living things. Moreover, it is this domain in human beingness that gives rise to the creation of values, ideals, and meaning. Being people in this condition and rooted in human subjectivity, we must say to ourselves at the outset of every action, if we are being honest and responsible in the world, am I really the kind of man who has the right to act in such a way that humanity might guide itself by my actions? Sartre says not to ask that question is to live in what he calls bad faith with oneself and with the world. Clearly, a depressed, weary, passive, and isolated person is not what Sartre has in mind here as someone who is taking responsibility for themselves and for the world. Such a person shirks their responsibility for their own life, as well as others' lives, with a kind of weary throwing up of the hands. What can be done? Nothing. Quite the contrary. According to Sartre, much can be done. Moreover, we are the only ones to do it, and we are doing it, even as we sit and say we are not, and deny our responsibility for it by saying we are just born this way, or we could not help it, or fate has decreed it. Resigned passivity is the result of a philosophy that relinquishes human life to fate and materialistic determinism. Existentialism, on the other hand, rejects fatalism and materialistic determinism and sees all of human life as an arena for action and responsibility rooted in the claim that there is no one but us. We will be what we make ourselves to be, and the world will be what we make of it, nothing more and nothing less. Sartre spends much of his essay describing the marks of living fully inside this awareness of responsibility and action, and he labels these with 3 words: anguish, forlornness, and despair. Misinterpreted, these concepts leave us depressed and passive. Properly understood, they have us out in the world trying to actualize our best plans for ourselves and for the world. By anguish, Sartre refers simply to the experience one has when living in complete acknowledgement of responsibility. He says, "What that anguish means is this: the man who involves himself and who realizes that he is not only the person he chooses to be, but also a lawmaker who is at the same time choosing all mankind as well as himself, cannot help escape the feeling of his total and deep responsibility. Of course, there are many people who are not anxious, but we claim that they are hiding their anxiety, that they are fleeing from it." Both of these, fleeing from the anguish itself or from the entire notion of being responsible, constitute bad faith in Sartre's view. He claims that anyone in a leadership position knows this anguish, such as a military commander who chooses whether to lead his soldiers into a battle, knowing that upon his choice depend the lives of his men. Of course, he could avoid responsibility and pass it on to his superiors, saying that in leading the men to battle he was simply following orders. Sartre says, however, that the commander interpreted the orders and decided whether or not to act on them. Therefore, he is responsible for his choice. Not to feel anguish in this position is not to take responsibility. Moreover, feeling the anguish does not allow for inaction on the part of the commander. He must still choose whether or not to send his soldiers into battle. Far from being an excuse for inaction, his anguish is the very condition of his action. This anguish, Sartre says, is not a curtain separating us from the action, but is a part of the action itself. Forlornness is very simple as well, says Sartre. By forlornness, he says, we mean only that God does not exist and that we have to face all of the consequences of this. Sartre rejects the modernist tendency in the West to claim atheism, yet still act as if a transcendent realm of morality, purpose, and meaning exists. In such a scheme, God is an outdated concept to be abandoned, yet the values and meanings grounded in God's existence can somehow still have the same ultimacy as if God existed, so society can proceed comfortably forward. Sartre finds this not only illogical, but also irresponsible. He says, "The existentialist, on the contrary, thinks it very distressing that God does not exist because all possibility of finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears along with him. There can no longer be an a priori good, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it." Dostoevsky said, "If God didn't exist, everything would be possible." That is the very starting point of existentialism. Indeed, everything is permissible if God does not exist, and as a result, man is forlorn because neither within him nor without does he find anything to cling to. He can't start making excuses for himself. The last sentence here is the point, and it is easy to miss. Sartre is not saying that we should just do anything we please because since God does not exist, nothing has any divinely appointed value and no notion of the good exists. Instead, he is saying that when we live in full awareness of these facts, we clearly see that we, not God, are responsible for everything. We have no recourse to relinquishing events in our lives or the world to God's will or God's plan or something of this nature. We decide what is good and valuable, not God. We feel the anguish that comes with this position, the incredible responsibility for everything, the forlornness or aloneness that is ours in the world. Not to feel this, or to try not to feel this, is making excuses for ourselves. Sartre goes so far as to say that even if God does exist, our human situation is not changed. He gives several examples in the essay of believers who live as if God has chosen their path for them, or as if the values they live and choose are grounded firmly in God. A woman who hears spiritual voices commanding her to do things, a student who gets life guidance from God via a priest, a Catholic who acts based on signs from God, and a Jesuit who sees the hand of God in the circumstances of his life. In all these instances, Sartre says people are evading responsibility, not because they dare to believe in God, but because they refuse to see their own responsibility in their belief. They do not see that they themselves determine what is or is not a sign from God, whether the voices heard are from God or the devil, whether the priest is right or not, how the sacred text is to be interpreted, and so on. Even if God exists and sends angels to speak to us, to give us revelation that we write down word for word, we are the ones who decide if the angels are worth listening to, and how to interpret the words they give us. In the end, we are still responsible. We cannot make excuses for ourselves, and we cannot let ourselves off the hook. Sartre, at the end of his essay, explains that existentialism spends no time defending its atheism, mainly because in the end it makes no difference with regard to human responsibility. He says, "Existentialism isn't so atheistic that it wears itself out showing that God doesn't exist. Rather, it declares that even if God did exist, that would change nothing." There you've got our point of view. Not that we believe God exists, but we think that the problem of his existence is not the issue. Either way, we are responsible for the world, our values, our meaning, and our purpose. There is no escaping this, and to try to do so is to live in bad faith with the world. Finally, by despair, Sartre means that we must act in the world as wholly responsible agents, without ever knowing if our actions will accomplish the desired results. We cannot, as Hegel does, rely on the transcendent Geist to guide history toward the ever higher goals of our actions, nor can we rely on innate human goodness or the ubiquity of truth or some such notion to ensure that our actions will bring about our desired future. Nothing is guaranteed, says Sartre. Given that men are free, and that tomorrow they will freely decide what man will be, I cannot be sure that after my death, fellow fighters will carry on my work to bring it to its maximum perfection. Tomorrow, after my death, some men may decide to set us fascism, and others may be cowardly and muddled enough to let them do it. Fascism will be the human reality, so much the worse for us. Actually, things will be as man will have decided they are to be. We have no guarantees that our actions will bear fruit after we are dead and out of the arena of action. Some would say, then, that this fact alone justifies inaction and passivity, and ask why one should bother to act if it is possible that our actions will not bear fruit. Again, Sartre says we are responsible. We remain responsible for the entire world even though we are limited by our own mortality. Thus, we experience despair. Sartre says, "Does this mean that I should abandon myself to quietism? No. First, I should involve myself. Then, act on the old saw. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Nor does it mean that I shouldn't belong to a party, but rather that I shall have no illusions and shall do what I can. For example, suppose I ask myself, will socialization as such ever come about? I know nothing about it. All I know is that I am going to do everything in my power to bring it about. Beyond that, I can't count on anything. Quietism is the attitude of people who say, 'Let others do what I can't do.' The doctrine I am presenting here is the very opposite of quietism, since it declares, there is no reality except in action. Moreover, it goes further, since it adds, man is nothing else than his plan. He exists only to the extent that he fulfills himself. He is therefore nothing else than the ensemble of his acts, nothing else than his life." So like anguish, despair is the condition of our actions and cannot be an excuse for inaction if we remain responsible for the world. The image in this passage is of people who give themselves fully to the tasks at hand, to those projects and plans to which they are most committed and find their highest fulfillment, all the while knowing that there are no guarantees that the work will be completed, but knowing also that they are wholly responsible for the world, no matter the anguish, forlornness, and despair. Important to mention here is that being responsible and having anguish, forlornness, and despair is not inherently a life of misery. Sartre goes so far as to say that existentialism is a kind of optimism, albeit a tough one. Life lived inside responsibility certainly involves sacrifice and suffering, but this does not equate to lifelong misery or depression. Life lived inside responsibility is a life of action, of achievement, of fulfillment of projects, a life of powerful creation. It is truly an invented life and an invented world, and it is invented by us, by human beings, beings distinct from all others because of our self-consciousness and our inner domain of valuation and conscience. Most people, of course, are horrified by the possibility of living such a created or invented life. They do not want to take full responsibility for their lives or the world, and prefer instead to make fate, God, circumstances, nature, or biology responsible for their lives. Being confronted with the horror of their responsibility, they flee into bad faith and lash out at the school of thought that asserts their responsibility. Sartre lived his own life as a social and political activist, a philosopher, a teacher, a soldier, and an involved citizen consistent with this idea of responsibility. Sartre says near the end of his essay, "Thus, I think we have answered a number of the charges concerning existentialism." You see that it cannot be taken for philosophy of quietism, since it defines man in terms of action, nor for a pessimistic description of man. There is no doctrine more optimistic, since man's destiny is within himself, nor for an attempt to discourage man from acting, since it tells him that the only hope is in his acting, and that action is the only thing that enables a man to live. Consequently, we are dealing here with an ethics of action and involvement. Gülen does not reject Sartre for his views about responsibility. In fact, Gülen and Sartre find powerful resonance on this theme, even while disagreeing on virtually everything else. As a Muslim and expositing his ideas completely within an Islamic context, Gülen speaks about issues of human agency and responsibility in the world in a way parallel to that of almost all theologians in the great monotheisms when addressing these topics. Indeed, these topics provide fodder for rich discussion, analysis, and debate over the centuries in all of the great religions that posit an all-powerful, all-knowing God. The crux of the issue is reconciling the tension between God's will and providence, on the one hand, and human will and action, on the other. Most monotheistic theologians, especially those who posit eternal reward and punishment, do not negate human free will because doing so negates human responsibility for their actions, which calls into question the justice of eternal heaven or hell as the reward for human action, a belief central to both Christianity and Islam. If humans have no free will, how can they be punished or rewarded for their actions? On the other hand, positing full free human agency seems to undermine the idea of divine providence. God is not the ultimate director of the world if humans in their free will choose another path for it. So this tension between God's providence and human free will receives a great deal of attention in theological circles, and the attempts to reconcile the tension or to moderate it are numerous and various across the traditions. We need not discuss these here except to say that this tension or issue is in the background as Gülen exposits his notions of human responsibility in the world. Thus, he will never say, in the way of Sartre, that human beings are wholly responsible for the world as it exists in history, because to do so undermines the idea of divine providence and decree, in which he very much believes. Gülen preaches the God of Islam, the all-powerful, all-knowing God who is the maker of heaven and earth and who knows all things. All reality and existence is what it is because of divine decree, and has no being or reality at all outside of that decree. This faith commitment qualifies every statement Gülen makes about human responsibility, and it is a fundamental difference in the worldviews of Sartre and Gülen that resists mediation. Gülen speaks about this issue, however, in a way that opens up a few channels of passage that help us understand how he can speak of the consciousness of responsibility in the way that he does in The Statue of Our Souls and elsewhere. He speaks of this issue using a key word which is translated in English as vicegerent or vicegerency. Using such a word already indicates, at least in English, that he is performing a subtle balancing act with regard to divine providence and human free will. Vicegerency means management, rulership, and responsibility, to be sure. The prefix vice, however, connotes deputization from a superior authority, even perhaps by decree. Here we have Gülen's perspective in a nutshell, along with that of many other theologians in the monotheistic traditions who are faced with the difficult challenge of reconciling divine providence and human free will. The all-knowing, all-powerful God, by decree, created existence in such a way that the human world inside this existence is affected by human agency. People either fulfill this charge or not, and suffer the consequences in this life and the next. Regardless, the infinite and thus mysterious, since our finite minds cannot comprehend infinity but can nevertheless be called by it, plans of God for the world and all existence remain fulfilled. Again, this is a delicate balancing act that may not completely resolve the tension between divine providence and human free will, but it does perhaps the best job of it that can be done that preserves a serious place for human agency and responsibility in the world, which is our concern here. Gülen bases his claims for human vicegerency on the Quran 2:30. I will create a vicegerent on earth. As vicegerents, human beings are divine representatives in the world. Gülen says, if humanity is the vicegerent of God on earth, the favorite of all his creation, the essence and substance of existence in its entirety, and the brightest mirror of the Creator, and there is no doubt that this is so, then the divine being that has sent humanity to this realm will have given us the right, permission, and ability to discover the mysteries embedded in the soul of the universe, to uncover the hidden power, might, and potential, to use everything to its purpose, and to be the representatives of characteristics that belong to Him, such as knowledge, will, and might. Here we see Gülen performing the delicate balancing act mentioned above. He powerfully affirms human beings as both the creation and the mirror of God. People are both creatures and reflections, submitted to the Creator and representatives of that same Creator. This is the position of the vicegerent. Submitted always to the decrees of God and always by that same decree, charged with representing and doing the work of that God in the world with the inner capacities that mirror those of God. Gülen further explains human vicegerency. Humanity's vicegerency for the Creator takes place in an unusually broad sphere that encompasses acts ranging from believing in Him and worshiping Him to understanding the mysteries within things and the cause of natural phenomena, and therefore being able to interfere in nature. These genuine human beings try to exercise their free will in a constructive manner, working with and developing the world, protecting the harmony between existence and humanity, reaping the bounties of the earth and the heavens for the benefit of humanity, trying to raise the hue, form, and flavor of life to a more humane level within the framework of the Creator's orders and rules. This is the true nature of a vicegerent. And at the same time, this is where the meaning of what is to be a servant and lover of God can be found. Notice the range of human action in the role of vicegerent, which includes religious acknowledgement and worship, scientific knowledge of the natural world, modes of interfering with or manipulating the natural world for positive ends, and improving human life in ever richer and more humane ways. As vicegerents, human beings are responsible for all this. They are accountable to God, as field agents for the fulfillment of their duties in these domains. Gülen discusses human vicegerency at length in The Statue of Our Souls, in a way that seems much more spirited and radical than in other writings. Early in the book, he takes up the discussion of divine providence and human free will, asserting in the end the delicate balance that we mentioned above. He adds an interesting reflection about human will. God grants to us free will and accepts it as an invitation to his will and willpower, and promises to establish the most essential projects upon this will, a plan he has implemented and continues to do so. God created our will as an occasion of merit or sin, and as a basis for recompense and punishment, and accepts it as an agent for ascribing to good and evil. This is why God attaches importance to our will and to the desires and wishes of humanity. He accepts it as a condition for the construction and prosperity of both this world and the hereafter, making it a considerable cause, like a magical switch to a powerful electrical mechanism that can illuminate the worlds. So here, Gülen asserts that the mechanism of human will established by God is the mechanism that determines the realities of both this world and the hereafter. To assert the supreme significance of human will and action in the world in no way undermines the will of God. Indeed, human will is the confirmation and the execution of God's will in the world, which is why departure from humaneness, faith, knowledge, and truth is so very problematic. To depart from these things is to abdicate the office of responsible vicegerency and to use the powers of that supreme office for ill, which impacts life at the most profound levels because the domain of accountability for that office includes both the entirety of this world and the next. In short, all reality. We begin to see then the beginning of a tone that Gülen takes throughout The Statue of Our Souls, a tone of passion and urgency that calls forth people who will fully take on this title of vicegerent and will bear on their backs the weight of responsibility inherent to the role. Throughout the rest of the book, Gülen details the character traits of these vicegerents, many of which have already discussed in the previous 2 chapters, because the ultimate vicegerents are the inheritors of the earth, the people of heart, or the ideal people. Here, however, we focus on those character traits that link directly to responsibility for the world. One of these traits is action, or being a person of action. Gülen explains, "Action is the most important and necessary component of our lives. By undertaking particular responsibilities through continuous acting and thinking, by facing and bearing particular difficulties, almost in a sense, by sentencing ourselves to all these, even though it may be at the expense of many things, we always have to act, to strive. If we do not act as we are dragged into the waves caused by the thrust and actions of others, and into the whirlpools of the plans and thoughts of others, and then we are forced to act on behalf of others. Remaining aloof from action, not interfering in the things happening around us, nor being a part of the events around us and staying indifferent to them, is like letting ourselves melt away, like ice turning to water." Astute readers will sense already the lines of resonance between Gülen and Sartre on this particular point. Gülen here identifies action as the chief component of human life. Only through action do we become the inheritors of the earth in the way described in earlier chapters. Only through action do we create ourselves and the world in the way discussed in this chapter. Without action, that is, involving ourselves, taking responsibility for things, and bearing the suffering that responsibility naturally involves, we relinquish ourselves to the actions of others. We relinquish our role as humans and vicegerents and choose instead a or other determined life similar to the existence of inanimate objects or animals who live according to hardwired instinct instead of choice and conscience. Our human beingness melts away from us when we refuse to act and to bear the responsibilities of action. In another passage, Gülen says that in choosing not to act, which of course is an action in itself, albeit an irresponsible one, we are choosing death. The most deeply significant aspect of existence is action and effort. inertia is dissolving, decomposition, and another name for death. Gülen says that people of action take many roles in society. Sometimes a loyal patriot, a hero of thoughtful action, sometimes a devoted disciple of science and learning, an artist of genius, a statesperson, and sometimes all of these. He spends an entire chapter summarizing the lives and work of recent figures in Turkish history. What distinguishes and unites them all, according to Gülen, is the incredible mantle of responsibility they wear for virtually everything. The call of the infinite they hear ringing throughout their conscience, that they are responsible for the world and that every molecule of their being and energy must be in the active service of that charge. Gülen explains. Their responsibility is such that whatever enters an individual's comprehension and conscious willpower never remains outside of theirs. Responsibility for the creation and events, nature and society, the past and the future, the dead and the living, the young and the old, the literate and the illiterate, administration and security, everybody and everything. And of course, they feel the pain of all these responsibilities in their heart. They make themselves felt as maddening palpitations, exasperation in the soul, always competing for their attention. The pain and distress that arise from the consciousness of responsibility, if it is not temporary, is a prayer, a supplication which is not rejected, and a powerful source of further alternative projects, and the note most appealing to consciences which have remained clear and uncorrupted. This is an extraordinary passage. First, notice the domain of responsibility. Everybody and everything, including the past and the dead. Nothing that can come into comprehension or consciousness is outside the domain of this responsibility. If we can think of it, and it is real, not imaginary, we are responsible for it. Second, notice the suffering that is the companion of responsibility, the pain and distress that comes with this consciousness. Gülen in this passage and elsewhere in his work speaks of the inner hardship that comes with taking seriously the role of vicegerent, of inheritor of the earth. Often he echoes Rumi, the great 13th century poet who writes so eloquently of the pain and suffering that accompanies great love, and of the anguished yearning for the beloved that is a profound suffering. Yet the lover will not give it up to avoid the suffering because the love of the beloved is the reason for existence, the soul of life itself. Gülen's vicegerents here are lovers of the beloved, and in this case, the beloved is God, God's creation, all reality which comes from God, everything and everybody. And to love the beloved is to be responsible for it. It is a yearning of suffering, a palpitation of the heart, and a quivering consciousness that is never avoided as long as one is in love. The lover is sentenced to it as a lover. It is not an obstacle to love. It is the very condition of that love. Finally, the passage above indicates that this responsibility is the homing bell of all true human beings, and that whenever they hear the note of this bell through the suffering, they activate more projects and plans. Gülen says people of responsibility love this responsibility so much that they would even give up paradise for it. The resonance with Sartre is obvious, even as we acknowledge that Gülen and Sartre generate their ideas and work from within utterly different philosophical frames, so much so that it seems unlikely at first glance that there should exist any resonance whatsoever between them. What is clear, however, is that each of them, from their respective and vastly different starting points, and within divergent worldviews, articulate parallel views of human life in the world with regard to human responsibility for the world. Both Sartre and Gülen give their complete intellectual energies to highlighting the urgent need in life for people to take responsibility for the world, and to reiterating the fact that the world has always been, and will continue to be, that which we make of it. Thus it is that either man, Gülen or Sartre, could have written these words from The Statue of Our Souls. Each and every person who has a sense of serious individual responsibility will say, I have to do this myself. If I do not do it now, to whatever extent I can, then probably no one will do it. And they will run forward to be the first to do it, to bear the flag high. We must rely on ourselves and our own powers, regardless of whether we believe they come to us from God, as Gülen does, or not, like Sartre, and refuse to expect something or someone outside of us to do our work for us. To push our responsibility onto others is to live in bad faith. To use Sartre's phrase, which, interestingly, squares quite well with Gülen's assessment of people of faith who refuse responsibility, they live a bad faith. A final quote from Gülen seals his vision for true human life and flourishing and illumines exactly what must take place if a world of goodness, truth, and freedom for everyone is to come into being, and the role that people play in bringing that world into being. Again, the spirit of the quote resonates with the spirit, albeit not the letter, of Sartrean sensibilities. Gülen says, "In fact, we need genius minds with iron wills that are able to carry the title of vicegerent of God on earth, and which are able to intervene in events and challenge the orphan spirit and puny thought which attach no importance to the consciousness of responsibility, humane values, knowledge, morality, true contemplation, virtue, and art in such a vast territory. We need refined minds and an iron will which will embrace and interpret creation in its depth and entirety, and humanity in all its worldly and otherworldly vastness." The deep spirit here is bravery, the bravery of responsibility. In our cowardice and bad faith, we flee from responsibility for our own lives and for the world. We, from a cowardly and puny spirit, make excuses for ourselves and blame the world's situation on others, or on fate, or on circumstances. All the while, the world rests on our shoulders, whether or not we acknowledge it, or take on the charge of that accountability. The world still rests on our shoulders, even as we choose death and inertia, the life of a piece of moss, or a chair, or a rock, the life less than that which is designed for us by God, or nature, or existence. Authentic life in the eyes of God or in the eyes of life is the life of accountability, and those who live it suffer the despair and anguish of that life, but they are also the beings who truly deserve the designation human. They have iron wills and brave hearts that push them forward amidst their distress into ever-expanded domains of responsibility for everyone and everything. These individuals are the true heroes of humanity, and it is on their backs that the world is made. As both Gülen and Sartre affirm, human society always has been and will continue to be what we human beings make of it.